Bendigo, Victoria, Southeast Australia. The late 1990s. A factory floor stretches under fluorescent light. The air smells of hot steel and cutting oil. Sparks fall in slow orange arcs from a welding rig somewhere in the back. And through a wide steel doorway, a machine begins to roll forward on rubber tires taller than a man. It looks, at first glance, like an armored school bus. Tall, wide, blunt across the nose, the front cab enclosed by thick tinted windows. The rear compartment large enough to seat 9 soldiers in cool, filtered air. There is even a fitting inside, written into the original specification, for chilled drinking water to be dispensed to the crew during operations. The vehicle weighs 15 tons. It cost the Australian government nearly twice its original estimate. It arrived 3 years late. Officers who inspected it were not impressed. One of them, walking slowly around it with a clipboard, called it a battle limousine. The nickname stuck. Procurement officials noted, dryly, that the entire project had almost been cancelled 4 separate times. The defense bureaucracy was not enthusiastic. The original order for 370 vehicles had already been cut down to 299. Critics inside the system called the whole program a cautionary tale, a story to be told to the next generation of procurement officers. A warning. It looked overbuilt. It looked overpriced. It looked overdue. And in the 20 years that followed, vehicles built on that same factory floor in Bendigo would survive more than 120 confirmed roadside bomb strikes across 4 war zones on 3 continents. In every confirmed roadside bomb strike involving Bushmasters in Australian service, all crew members survived the blast. 9 nations would buy the vehicle. Paratroopers would use it to lead the fastest armored advance in modern European warfare. It earned a reputation among coalition forces for an exceptional record of crew survivability against roadside bombs. Its official designation was the Bushmaster Protected Mobility Vehicle. And on that winter day in Bendigo, nobody watching it roll off the line had any idea what it was about to become. To understand why the Bushmaster existed, you have to go back 12 years. Back to a paper published in Canberra in 1987. The Australian Defence White Paper of that year did not talk about foreign wars. It did not talk about tanks rolling across the plains of Europe. It talked about the North. Australia's total coastline stretches about 35,000 kilometers on the mainland. That is farther than the distance from New York to Sydney, and back, and to New York again. It is a coastline of red rock, salt flats, mangrove swamps, and empty beaches where no road ends. Vast, remote, exposed. The white paper emphasized defending Australia's northern approaches against low-level incursions and raids, landing by sea, operating in terrain where the response of a conventional army would be slow and unreliable. Canberra needed something new. It needed a vehicle that could carry a 9-man infantry section deep into that country. 3 days. No resupply. Temperatures that reached 50 degrees Celsius. That is 122 degrees Fahrenheit. A furnace on wheels. And the vehicle had to keep running. But there was a second thread, running quietly beneath the strategic paperwork. Australian officers and observers returned from overseas deployments and exchanges, carrying valuable lessons about mine-protected vehicles developed in southern Africa. Home from missions where they had stood alongside other armies who had learned things that Australia had not yet had to learn. Southern African armies, South African engineers, men who had spent 2 decades fighting a very particular kind of war, a war fought against buried explosives on unpaved roads. They had developed a solution, not more armor, not thicker steel bolted onto the belly of a truck, something stranger, something almost obvious once you had seen it. They shaped the hull of the vehicle underneath the crew compartment into the letter Phi, 2 flat panels of steel, angled sharply downward, meeting at a ridge along the center line of the vehicle. When a mine buried in the road detonated below, the force of the explosion did not slam upward into the floor. It hit those angled panels and split. It went sideways. It skidded out and away from the crew. The blast still hit the vehicle. Sometimes it destroyed the vehicle, but the men inside walked away. Australian officers who had stood beside those South African vehicles came home carrying that idea in their heads. They went to briefings. They went to procurement meetings. They stood in front of colonels who had never seen a mine strike, and they argued that the next Australian armoured carrier should be built the same way, from the ground up, around a V-shaped hull. The concept gradually gained support within Australian defence planning. In July of 1994, the Australian government formally opened the competition. It was called Project Bushranger. Internally, it carried the designation Land 116. It was, on paper, a routine procurement. 17 companies submitted proposals. By January of 1997, the field had been narrowed down to two. The first was called the Taipan, a South African design, built by men who had fought the exact war the Australians were preparing for. On paper, it was the safe choice, a finished product, from an army with hard-won experience. The second was something quieter, a prototype, designed and built in Adelaide by a company called Perry Engineering. It was smaller than the big names in the field. Its designers licensed a suspension system from a firm in Ireland called Taimani Technology. They drew their automotive components from American military truck production because they wanted their vehicle to share parts with Allied logistics chains. Roughly 65% of the components could be sourced through the same suppliers that already served the American army. That was not an accident, that was a calculation. The prototype was built in under 7 months. Perry Engineering did not have the reputation. It did not have the pedigree. But the vehicle they built had the V hull. It had the range. It had the promise of a machine that could be maintained anywhere an American truck could be maintained. And it had one more thing that mattered. It was Australian. The idea might have been imported, but the steel would be cut in Australia. The welds would be laid in Australia. The jobs would stay in Australia. In March of 1999, Australian Defence Industries, which had by then acquired the Perry design and its rights, won the contract. The Commonwealth signed for 370 vehicles. The price was approximately 170 million Australian dollars. The vehicles were to be delivered by December of 2002. The champagne, if there was any, did not last. The schedule started slipping almost immediately. Costs climbed. Design changes multiplied. Every engineering team that looked at the vehicle wanted to change something. A stronger weld here, a different mount there, a relocated fuel line. Each change had a reason. Each change added weeks. Each change added money. In July of 2002, the contract was torn up and rewritten. The Commonwealth now agreed to buy 299 vehicles, not 370. The price had risen to 329 million Australian dollars. The first delivery was pushed back to August of 2004. That is not a small slip. That is a program that has consumed 3 extra years and an additional $159 million. And it has done all of this while producing exactly 0 vehicles in service. Around the boardroom table in Canberra, careers were quietly ending. The project came within weeks of being killed. Not once. Not twice. 4 separate times. The paperwork was drafted to cancel the whole program. 4 separate times. A decision maker somewhere pulled the paperwork back. Sometimes for good reasons. Sometimes for stubborn ones. Sometimes just because nobody wanted to be the officer whose name went on the memo that killed Australia's only serious attempt to build a modern armoured vehicle from scratch. The vehicle that finally emerged from Bendigo was born under a shadow. 15 tons of steel, 9 seats. Air conditioning that officers mocked. Chilled water fittings that officers mocked more. A rear door big enough to unload a full infantry section in seconds. A monocoque hull, welded from high-hardness steel in a single continuous structure. Not bolted, welded, cast as one piece. And underneath it, hidden from the eye of anyone who did not know to look. The V, 2 flat panels of hardened steel meeting at a ridge, running the length of the vehicle. The idea that Australian peacekeepers had brought home from Africa. The idea that South African engineers had developed over 2 decades of dirty war. The idea that had almost been buried under $329 million of paperwork. The idea that was about to keep several hundred men alive. In September of 2001, on a clear blue morning half a world away, 4 airliners were turned into weapons. The world that the Bushmaster had been designed for, a world of coastal defense and slow peacetime patrol, ended in the span of a single hour. The world it would actually fight in was about to begin, and the vehicle rolling off the line in Bendigo, the one that officers were still calling the battle limousine, the one that critics inside the defense bureaucracy were still muttering about, was, quietly, without anyone yet understanding it, exactly the vehicle that history was about to ask for. It was overbuilt. That, it would turn out, was the point. May of 2005. Southern Iraq. 10 Bushmasters roll off a transport ship at the port of Qasr. The paint is fresh, the tires are new, the engines have been broken in on training grounds outside Darwin, but they have never smelled the dust of a war zone. Now they will. The vehicles are assigned to the Australian Al-Muthanna Task Group, a small contingent operating in a province still littered with unexploded ordnance from 2 previous wars. The ground here is old. The mines are older. Some of them were buried during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. Others were placed last week. Some mines dated from earlier conflicts, while many newer explosive devices were laid during the insurgency, and a new insurgency was busy laying fresh charges on top of the old ones. But the effect on a wheel and an axle and a floor plate is the same. The men driving the Bushmasters are young. Most of them are in their early 20s. Some of them have never seen combat. Some of them have never left Australia before. They have been told that the vehicle they are driving will keep them alive. They have been told this by procurement officers who have never sat in the driver's seat during a blast. They will find out for themselves. Across the province, Australian patrols begin to run the routes that other coalition vehicles refuse to run. Unpaved tracks, old caravan roads, dry riverbeds. The Bushmaster could safely operate on routes where lighter vehicles such as the Humvee faced greater risks. It rides higher. It carries more. It has that V hidden under the belly, angling down toward the sand. There are strikes. There are always strikes. But no Australian soldier dies inside a Bushmaster in southern Iraq. Not one. The vehicle passes its first war quietly. It comes home. It gets repainted. It gets ready for what is coming next. August of 2006. Afghanistan. The Australian Mentoring and Reconstruction Task Force deploys to Uruzgan province in the country's rugged center. Uruzgan is not a province. It is a killing ground. Mountains cut it into narrow valleys. Rivers dry in summer and flood in spring. There is one main road. Everyone uses it. The Taliban knows this. They have been watching coalition vehicles for years by now. They know which ones die from a small charge and which ones need a bigger one. They have learned to identify Humvees from a kilometer away by the shape of the dust behind them. They have learned that a Land Rover can be killed by a single shell buried under gravel. They have learned that some vehicles need to be hit twice. Then the Bushmasters arrive. They roll out of the multinational base at Tarankot in convoys of 4 and 5. They head into the valleys. And within weeks, the intelligence reports coming back to Canberra begin to describe something the analysts have trouble believing. The vehicles are being struck. Regularly. The men inside are not dying. 5 weeks. That is how long it takes the Dutch government to make its decision. The Royal Netherlands Army has been operating in Uruzgan alongside the Australians. They have their own aging armoured carriers. Vehicles that were adequate for European peacekeeping in the 1990s. Vehicles that are not adequate for what the roads outside Tarankot are doing to them. Their commanders see the Australian Bushmasters. They ask questions. They watch. In July of 2006, the Netherlands opens a formal evaluation of 8 candidate vehicles. In some armies, that process takes years. 2 years. 4 years. In some armies, it takes a decade. The Dutch decision is made in 5 weeks. They sign a contract for 25 Bushmasters. 23 of them will not be built new. There is no time. 23 vehicles are pulled directly from Australian Army stocks, loaded onto transport aircraft, flown to Afghanistan. The remaining 2 go to the Netherlands, so Dutch crews can train. Few peacetime procurement programs have moved that quickly. But this is not peacetime. And Dutch soldiers are dying in the vehicles they have. September 20th, 2007, Uruzgan province. A Dutch patrol Bushmaster is returning from a firefight. It is carrying wounded men. The crew has already done its job. The vehicle just needs to make it back. It does not make it back. First comes small arms fire. Then mortar rounds start walking in across the road. Then, from the compound wall 200 meters to the east, a rocket-propelled grenade streaks out and hits the flank of the vehicle. Then another. Then another. The engine dies. The wheels stop. Inside, the men press themselves against the hull. They can hear the impacts. They can feel the vehicle shake. They know what those sounds mean when they hit a lighter vehicle. They do not know, yet, what those sounds mean when they hit a bushmaster. The firing continues. The vehicle sits immobile in the road. Radios crackle. A quick reaction force is dispatched. Air support is requested. And one by one, in a lull in the fire, the Dutch soldiers extract from the crew compartment and are pulled out under the cover of another vehicle. All of them. Not one of them killed. Not one of them missing a limb. The wounded who were already inside from the earlier firefight, still alive. The vehicle is a wreck. It cannot be recovered. The enemy is pressing the area. If it is left, it will be photographed. It will be dissected. It will be paraded. Command makes the call. A Dutch AH-64. Apache is turned around from another tasking and vectored to the site. The gunner sights on the vehicle his own army bought 14 months ago, and he pulls the trigger. Missiles hit the bushmaster. The steel cracks open. Fuel burns. The damaged vehicle was deliberately destroyed to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. The men it protected are already at the aid station. By the middle of 2008, the Dutch have lost 6 bushmasters to enemy action. Not one Dutch soldier has died inside any of them. The Netherlands does not slow the order. They accelerate. 10 more vehicles in November of 2007. 13 more in June of 2008. More after that. By the year 2021, the Dutch fleet has grown to 116 vehicles. The Australians, meanwhile, are being taught something the manufacturer never advertised. Several soldiers survived multiple Bushmaster blast incidents over the course of the campaign. The same names keep appearing on the after-action reports. Corporal David Nicholson, serving with an Australian mentoring task force, is a soldier of ordinary rank in an ordinary unit. He is not famous. He is not a decorated ace. He is a man who does his job in a hard place. His job puts him inside a bushmaster in Uruzgan. The first time his vehicle is struck by a buried explosive, he steps out shaken but whole. He goes back to work. The second time his vehicle is struck by a buried explosive, he steps out shaken but whole. He goes back to work. 2011. The Mirabad Valley. Nicholson is inside a bushmaster moving through country the Taliban knows intimately. Somewhere under the road ahead, in a hole that was dug in the last 24 hours, sits an improvised explosive device. Nobody in the convoy sees it. Nobody could have seen it. The blast lifts the 15-ton vehicle onto 2 wheels. Windows shatter inward. Dust fills the cabin. Some of the soldiers are bloodied. The vehicle is severely damaged. Nicholson climbs out. That is the 3rd time. 3 strikes. 3 walks. 1 man. In 1 type of vehicle. 3 times. The people who wrote the white paper in 1987 did not know his name. The engineers at Perry Engineering in Adelaide did not know his name. The procurement officers who almost cancelled the program 4 times did not know his name. But he was the man they were arguing about, in a way they could not have understood. He was the outcome. He was what the arguments were for. July 10th, 2012. The Dehrawood district of Uruzgan province. A dusty morning. A patrol from the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, is running a supply convoy. They are part of Mentoring Task Force 5. Their vehicles are strung out along a road that is barely a road. It is packed earth, ruts, loose gravel. On either side, low mud-walled compounds and irrigation ditches. The lead vehicle has a call sign. Echo 2, 1 Alpha. Private Matthew Clark is driving. Beside him, Crew Commander Kurt Bebbington. In the back, Sapper Rowan Jameson. Private Anak Vindiarna. Private Mitchell Smith. Private Daniel Snedon. 6 men. 6 seats. one Bushmaster. Buried directly beneath the road they are about to drive over is a device that has been assembled with patience. A 20-liter palm oil container, the kind farmers use across southern Afghanistan, packed tight with homemade explosive. Stacked, layered, designed to concentrate the blast upward. Beneath it, wired into the trigger, sits a commercial anti-tank mine. The front right tire of Echo 2 1 Alpha rolls over the trigger. Matthew Clark will later describe what happened next in very simple words. He saw two bright white flashes. He heard nothing at all. The rear door of the vehicle blew outward. Dust flooded the compartment. When the noise stopped, he looked down. His right foot was shaking. Across both of his legs, 14 bones were broken. But he was awake. He was alive. And beside him, Kurt Bebington was alive. And behind him, Jameson, Windiarna, Smith, and Snedden were alive. Two of them were seriously wounded. All of them were breathing. Every calculation of a blast that size, every model, every simulation, every previous war fought over roads seeded with charges of that magnitude would tell you that the men inside Echo 2 1 Alpha should be dead. They were not dead. The vehicle they were in had, once again, done exactly what a factory floor in Bendigo had promised it would do. Now, while 6 men are being lifted onto medevac helicopters in Uruzgan, it is worth asking a harder question. A question that does not sit comfortably. Why did the largest army in the world, the Army of the United States, not have this vehicle? The answer is not simple, but it is not flattering either. The United States launched its own program in 2007. It was called MRAP, Mine Resistant Ambush Protected. Billions of dollars, roughly 10,000 vehicles built in an emergency crash program, because American casualties from roadside bombs in Iraq had climbed to numbers that were becoming politically unsustainable. The most produced American variant was called the Max Pro. It weighed 17.7 tons. The British ordered a variant of their own. It was called the Mastiff. It weighed 24 tons. Both offered good blast protection. Both had V-shaped hulls, borrowed from the same southern African tradition the Australians had drawn on years earlier. But both were heavy, very heavy. A vehicle that weighs 24 tons cannot cross a mud-walled village bridge that was built for donkey carts. A vehicle that weighs 17 tons cannot fit inside a C-130 Hercules transport aircraft. And a vehicle that cannot leave the main road becomes, over time, a predictable target. The Taliban were patient. They watched. They noted which roads the heavy Americans and heavy British had to use, because their vehicles could not use anything else. And they seeded those roads. The Bushmaster weighed 15.4 tons. It fit inside a Hercules. It rolled off the main road onto dried riverbeds and old caravan tracks. It went places the heavier vehicles could not go, and because it could go there, the enemy could not always predict where it would be. That unpredictability, that ability to leave the road, saved more lives than another ton of steel plate would have. Australian engineers had understood that from the beginning. American procurement prioritized heavier protection under urgent wartime conditions, while Australia pursued a lighter and more mobile solution. Each reflected different operational priorities. The Bushmaster was smaller. It was lighter. It was, by every specification sheet, less protected than a Max Pro, and it kept its men alive. The men lifted from Echo 2 1 Alpha were flown to Kandahar. From Kandahar, some went to Germany. Then home. Matthew Clark spent months in rehabilitation. Kurt Bebington began his own long recovery. The vehicle itself was recovered from the road at Dera Wood. Twisted, blackened, missing pieces of its front end, but identifiable, traceable. Every welded joint on its hull still legible to the engineers who had built it. It went back to Australia. The engineers took it apart. They measured what had broken. They measured what had held. They fed the answers into the next production batch. That was the discipline that turned a 15-ton vehicle from Bendigo into one of the most survivable protected mobility vehicles of the post-9/11 era. Not marketing, not myth. A cycle. A vehicle got hit. A team went in. Steel got measured. The next vehicle got better. Echo 2, 1 Alpha itself did not go back to war. It went somewhere else, somewhere that the men who had ridden in it would eventually visit, somewhere that the workers who had welded it would eventually be invited to see it again. But that visit was still years away. And in Uruzgan, in the summer of 2012, the war was not over. 2014, northern Mali, 12,000 kilometers from the factory floor in Bendigo. A Dutch patrol is moving through open country outside the town of Kidal. The heat is different here from the heat of Uruzgan. The dust is a different color. The enemy is different. The war is a different war. But the road under the tires is doing the same thing. Roads under tires have been doing for 100 years. Somewhere along it, buried in the dirt, is a charge waiting for a wheel. The wheel arrives. The charge fires. The blast throws dirt and smoke into the air. The Bushmaster shudders. The men inside feel the whole vehicle lift, then drop, then settle. No one is killed. No one is seriously wounded. And then something happens that even the engineers in Bendigo, watching the after-action report come in from West Africa, find hard to describe without smiling. The vehicle drives itself back to base. Not towed, not recovered, not lifted onto a flatbed by a heavy crane. It starts. It rolls. The suspension is damaged. The armor is scarred. But the drivetrain works. The steering works. The engine turns over. The crew climbs back inside their own vehicle and rides it home. That was Mali. Then came something no one had planned for. March 31st, 2022. The Australian Parliament in Canberra. The chamber is quiet. Members of Parliament sit at their desks. On a large screen at the front of the room, a video feed opens from a bunker somewhere in Kyiv. Volodymyr Zelensky is on the screen. He is in a green shirt. His face is tired in a way that television lighting cannot hide. Behind him, the walls are bare. It is late in his day. It is morning in Canberra. He speaks in Ukrainian, translated into English in real time. He thanks Australia. He talks about the war. He talks about the cost of the war. And then he does something that no foreign leader in living memory has done in that chamber. He asks for a specific vehicle. By name. He says the word Bushmaster. He tells the parliament that these vehicles could significantly help Ukraine. He tells them the vehicles would do more for common security in the world than sitting covered with dust somewhere in an Australian storage depot. Members of parliament look at each other. Nobody had briefed them for this. Nobody had told them a Ukrainian president knew the product name of a 15-ton Australian troop carrier built in a country town in Victoria. But he did know. His generals knew. Because the men who had bought Bushmasters years earlier, the Dutch, the British, the New Zealanders, had told him. The reputation of the vehicle from Bendigo had travelled ahead of any Australian diplomat. It had travelled through soldiers. In the way things travel through soldiers, quietly, reliably, without press releases. 8 days after the speech, the first 4 Bushmasters were rolling up the ramp of a Royal Australian Air Force C-17 Globemaster at RAAF Base Amberley. 4 vehicles per aircraft. That was the load. That was what the transport could carry. The Bushmaster fit. The MRAP had never fit. The lightness that critics had once complained about was again doing its job. Over the following weeks, the airlift became routine. Another flight, another 4 vehicles, another delivery to a Ukrainian rail yard where they would be dispersed to units at the front. 20 vehicles in the first tranche, then more. By the end of the delivery program, 120 Bushmasters had been given to Ukraine. To replace them, in May of 2023, the Australian government placed a fresh order with the factory in Bendigo, 78 new vehicles. The line kept running. September of 2022. The plains east of Kharkiv. Ukrainian paratroopers are inside Bushmasters that were, until recently, sitting in an Australian storage depot. The paint is Australian bushland green. The manuals in the glove compartment are in English. The men driving them do not speak English. They have learned by pointing and by doing. They are moving fast. The Kharkiv counter-offensive of that autumn is the fastest ground advance of the war so far. Ukrainian units, moving in a mix of Western armored vehicles and captured Russian equipment, are punching through Russian lines that were assumed to be solid. They are covering 7 kilometers a day. On some days, more. They retake the city of Izium. They retake Kupiansk. They retake Lyman. And along the way, the Bushmasters absorb what they are asked to absorb. Mortar rounds detonate alongside the flanks of the vehicles. Bushmasters also survived near misses from rockets, artillery, and anti-tank mines during the campaign. Anti-tank mines strip wheels and shatter suspensions. The hulls hold. The men inside keep moving. In an interview with a foreign think tank later that year, Zelensky is asked about Western equipment. He speaks about many things. When the Bushmaster comes up, he chooses a specific word. He says it has performed masterfully. The Ukrainian paratroopers who ride in them choose their own word, a less formal one. They call it a home on wheels. There is a photograph, somewhere in the archives of Australian defense reporting, that is not famous. It is not on any recruiting poster. It is just a photograph. It shows a factory floor, Bendigo, the same factory floor where a battle limousine rolled off a line in the late 1990s. Standing on that floor are 6 men. Some of them stand with the careful posture of men whose backs and legs have been rebuilt. They are Matthew Clark, Kurt Bebbington, Rowan Jameson, Anak Windiarna, Mitchell Smith, Daniel Snedon. 12 years earlier, they were the 6 men inside Echo 21 Alpha when the road exploded under them at Dera Wood. Behind them, on the factory floor, is a large enclosed cell of yellow steel and cabling. Inside that cell is a robotic welding arm. It hums quietly. It is welding the hull of a Bushmaster that will one day be delivered to some army in some country and will probably be shot at. The workers at the Thales factory in Bendigo have given the machine a name. They call it Debbie. Debbie is not a person. Debbie is a nickname the men in Uruzgan gave to their Bushmaster, Echo 21 Alpha, before the war. When the vehicle was recovered from the blast at Dera Wood, when it was flown home to Australia, when it was restored and placed on permanent display in the Anzac Hall at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, the workers at Bendigo took the name and they gave it to the robot. The robot that built the vehicle that saved them. Now the 6 men stand next to the robot. They can hear it working. They can smell the ozone and the hot metal. They can see it laying down the same welds along the same V-shaped hull that had held together underneath them. 12 years earlier, in a place none of them ever wanted to see again. Matthew Clark said something quiet about the visit afterward. He said that standing next to Debbie made him feel that he had, at long last, finally completed the resupply mission. He had been on his way to deliver supplies when the blast lifted his vehicle. He never got there that day. 12 years later, standing in the factory that had built his vehicle, he felt, at least in his own words, that the mission was closed. April of 2026. Canberra. The Australian government announces an order. 268 next-generation Bushmasters. 750 million Australian dollars. First production is scheduled for 2027. The factory in Bendigo will be building Bushmasters into the early 2030s. By then, the Bushmaster will have been in Australian service for more than 30 years. It will have fought in southern Iraq, in Uruzgan, in Mali, on the plains of Kharkiv. 9 nations will have operated it. 6 of them will have used it in combat. 1 of them will have received 120 of them as gifts of war. The men who wrote the white paper in 1987 were worried about the north coast of Australia. Small parties landing by sea. That war never came. A different one did. The men at Perry Engineering in Adelaide, the ones who submitted a prototype in 7 months and licensed a suspension from an Irish firm they had never met in person, did not know they were designing the vehicle that Volodymyr Zelensky would ask for by name. The engineers in Bendigo who welded the hull of Echo 21 Alpha in the early 2000s did not know they were welding the vehicle that would carry Matthew Clark and 5 other men out of a blast that should have killed them. The soldiers who nicknamed their vehicle Debbie in Uruzgan did not know they were naming a robot that would still be at work in Bendigo a decade later, building the next generation of the same machine. Bushmasters developed a remarkable reputation for protecting their crews through numerous roadside bomb attacks across multiple deployments. That number is not a boast. It is a summary. It is the sound of dozens of families that never received the phone call. It is the sound of Matthew Clark's mother learning that her son was alive. It is the sound of 6 men standing next to a robot named after their vehicle. It is the sound of a piece of steel folded into the shape of a V, welded together in a country town in Victoria, by workers who probably never met the soldiers whose lives they were about to save. The critics of that late 1990s factory floor were not wrong on the numbers. The vehicle was late. It was over budget. It was heavier than the drawings promised. It was called a battle limousine. And the nickname stuck. Because for a moment, it fit. But the engineers who fought for it understood something the accountants and procurement officers did not. Protection is not an option. Protection is not a package you bolt onto a finished truck. Protection is the truck. The V-hull was not a feature of the Bushmaster. The V-hull was the reason for the Bushmaster. Everything else, the engine, the seats, the chilled water, the tinted windows, was arranged around that one idea. Direct the blast outward. Keep the men above the ridge alive. It was overbuilt. That was always the point.